the world vastly overproduces grains and vastly overproduces sugar and oils and vastly underproduces fruit and vegetables. Or putting it another way, the world at the moment is not growing the right sorts of food in the right sorts of ways for everybody to access healthy diets. But this is a figure, a map showing the cost of nutrients relative to the cost of calories. And the darker the color it is, the more difficult it is to get a nutritionally balanced diet rather than one that is just full of calories. We know our systems are fragile. We know they're increasingly going to be hit by crises, and therefore we have to start thinking about how to build more resilient systems, because we should stop thinking about shocks as being a rare event and say almost every year something is going to go wrong somewhere that is going to shock the system. The world is tuna. It is turbulent in the sense that it changes very, very fast. It is uncertain because it's almost impossible to predict how the world is going to be, not just next week, next month, next year, next decade. Every timescale you look at, it is very uncertain. The world is increasingly novel in the sense that we're having to cope with things that we've never thought that we'd have to cope with, that we've never seen before. And the world is increasingly ambiguous, that in any given decision, there's no longer a right or wrong.
The scenarios that we need to think about need to be focused on no regrets options, on situations that will, on actions that would strengthen resilience and diversity regardless of how the unknowns play out. What the public sector, or the global public sector, should be doing is to safeguard that incredible variety of useful plant genes out there that we're not that they will otherwise not be conserved.
But people don't eat commodities. They eat complex mixtures of food-like substances, as Tim talked about, the ultra-processed foods, and more the world is eating those foods. They make up a larger proportion of the diet everywhere, in very rural places to very urbanized places. And these, of course, are not considered healthy, but they are cheap. You can store them for a long time. They're tasty, and they're convenient. So as we think about rejiggering agriculture, we need to think about the entire food system. And I hope the CG starts to move beyond just the basic commodities and be thinking that people don't eat those. They eat very complex configurations of food.
The very concept of agriculture and the very concept of food is changing, and that's something we need to take into account. And when you're framing what the role of gene banks in the long term, you need to be ensuring not betting on one scenario but betting on all of them, and creating a strategy that encompasses all of those future potential states.
We need to make sure that we focus on what is relevant to the gene banks. When I was looking at those diagrams of alternative futures, whether we follow the vicious cycles still further or change to virtuous cycles, those are very important diagrams, but part of the point of gene banks is that we have the diversity that will allow us to respond to any of these challenges. And it may not be necessary to go to guess which specific challenge comes in the future, because that's what we're designed to cope with, any of them, except that, of course, it is not any of them that we can cope with. Right? We're not set up to cope with the enormously rapid rate of response that we now need. So we do have to change how gene banks are able to respond more quickly. And if we do go to a more healthy diet, meaning a much wider range of crops ex situ, obviously we don't have the gene bank set up in the CGIAR. And is there any possibility in the future that we would be allowed to set up gene banks for different crops if it was necessary?
I would like to suggest here, probably we need to increase the definition of the genetic resources. We generally say food, genetic resources for food and agriculture. I would like to add a few more words into it. If that definition could be broad, and anyhow, it could be food and there's genetic resources for food and nutrition security, environmental stability, and good health. Because this good health will include many more things. It may include a lot more vegetables. It may include a large number of the medicinal plants, which are being used in very small quantities, but they could be a part of this one.
What I am less convinced is that the other component, let's say the demand side, if we want to mention it in economic terms, we have less clarity in the importance of the gene banks. In my case, I'm a celiac, so I know what is a poisonous food or non-nutrition food for me. But if we extend that further, and the Israelis are right that there is a personalized diet, that every person's biome is totally different, and then we will need a different approach of how we select what is a healthy diet for every single individual. We might be facing a second part of the equation. In summary, I think we are working the supply side with some good ideas and explanation, and we are less so in the demand side, or meaning the consumer side.
Now we have 4 big companies which are leading the world's seed market. That's a huge strength for our sector, but there's a huge amount of seed produced by farmers still in the developing world. They are going to, there's traditional breeders, there's biotechnologists. You cannot just say, because now there's new biotechnological tools, the rest of those uses of genetic resources do not exist anymore.
We need to make sure that whatever decisions we make now, we maintain, enrich, and even continue to improve the diversity of the material that we have in the gene banks today, because with the advances in science in the future, we will be able to resolve and probably identify solutions for current and future food security in a very different way from what we think we know at this point in time.
I think a lot of conversation as well about the need to look at this broader genetic base for what we want to conserve, and to think about looking beyond the currently dominant crops, not to let our attention be too strongly focused on the historical mandate of the CG and what the food system looked like, or what we believed it would look like when the gene banks were set in place 30, 40, 50 years ago. And if we think that the long-term genetic base for agriculture might be different from what we see today, then again, that steers us into thinking much more broadly. All agreed that the demand for diversity will be strong in a system beset by all kinds of future challenges, but making sure that we have the right materials in gene banks, that they're adequately characterized, evaluated, documented, and that documentation is digitized. An import-dependent system is often willing to ignore its own genetic resources and to rely on genetic resources coming from embodied in or embedded in the imported food. And that would raise serious concerns around conservation, how we make sure that we conserve, that the incentives are there to conserve the genetic resources within that region.
The gene banks are finally going to be a really important source of alleles for adaptation to climate change in the major cereals. And it would be a mistake to think that now that we finally have the tools, that either that was all going to be done by the private sector, or that there wasn't an opportunity there.
As I said in our breakout group, because of a burning sense of injustice about the fairness and the equity of the subsequent system. And that's what's driving it. And I mean, increased nationalism and less globalization will just make that situation worse. And I think one of the most important things that the international system needs to do is to reaffirm the importance of collaboration because of interdependence. To say, look, in the face of climate change, we are going to need not just more variety. And I actually agree with the point just made about, you shouldn't write off the major row crops, because we do need the variety in those. But But for the sake of nutrition, for the sake of more ecological farming systems, for the sake of a better connection between people and their livelihoods and nature, we need to expand the number of crops that we rely on for our food system. And for that, under scenarios of climate change, we need access to the genetics of new crops, because 20 years from now, you will need either genetics, or you will need species that come from other parts of the world. I mean, from an African perspective, right, we have the most drought-adapted, heat-adapted species in the world. And if the world's going, the parts of the world that are definitely going to get drier and hotter will need African genetics.
Perhaps the key to the future is the linkage between the national and international gene banks, and to make sure that the role of the international gene banks is supportive of, not conflicting with, aligned with more national gene banks, providing leadership in science, management, in situ resource conservation. How do you make sure that there is enough genes in the right places to allow access to them from wherever you are in the world and whatever community you're in?